Armed conflict has been with us since the dawn of civilization. Archaeologists have unearthed evidence of armies as far back as 10,000 BC. Military history has always existed on a grand scale, with legendary battles fought on land, sea, and air. From ancient daggers to modern medals of honor, in expert hands, these relics reveal the stories of those who are no longer here to speak for themselves. Join us as we unlock the secrets of Militaria. Today on Militaria, we will look at artifacts belonging to members of war regiments during the World Wars, sweetheart pins that symbolize love, as well as a legendary blade of steel. Mark People looks at a Middle Eastern-style dagger, special for its Damascus steel with a waved surface pattern.
Damascus is an early Arabic term for water, and it's the idea that the surface may look like ripples in water.
Gary Melville looks at release papers and a newspaper clipping passed down from the World Wars.
It's quite unusual to see someone released in 1915. Obviously, this was something quite severe that afflicted a great-grandfather for the Army to release him.
Jennifer Denty looks at World War II sweetheart pins, once a popular gift that soldiers sent back to their loved ones.
The different things that my father could do, this would be a task that he would really like to have done. And I'm pretty sure that he is the maker of this lighter. My name is Dave Oakey, and I brought in today some mementos from my father had during his time in the Navy during World War II. One of them is a very unique Ronson lighter that has hat badges on it, which was quite interesting. I brought his medal box in as well, and his trade badge and his unit crest as well is included in there.
During the Second World War, if you saw a woman wearing a brooch depicting a symbol of a Canadian regiment, it likely meant her husband or boyfriend was serving overseas. So-called sweetheart jewelry was a popular gift that soldiers, sailors, and airmen sent home to loved ones. Initially made popular during the First World War, sweetheart jewelry included pins, brooches, and other trinkets depicting a service member's regiment or other military and patriotic symbols. It was advertised to service members as a way of showing their love for those awaiting their safe return. Best of all, sweetheart jewelry was easy to purchase and mail. It was a welcome way to stay connected during long, tense years of separation.
Hi Dave, welcome to the set.
Well, thank you for having me.
Do you mind telling us a little bit about what you brought today?
Well, I brought a few artifacts that my father had during World War II.
So what you have is the Kanagami ship's crest.
His uniform trade badge.
I see your father was awarded the 3945 medal, the Atlantic Star, the Volunteer Service Medal, and this World War II medal.
War medal.
The bracelet that is beautifully engraved. His Royal Canadian Naval Association pin. And last but definitely not least is this beautiful lighter.
The Ronson lighter that is embossed with about 22 or 23 hat badges of the Canadian Forces. So Jen, can you tell me a little bit about that lighter?
So the lighter was a very standard thing for people to have. Smoking was a thing that was very commonly done in that time. So it was not only a very handy practical tool to have, but it was also a great way to get little mementos or keepsakes that are small and easy to keep with you when your space is very, very limited. So oftentimes we'll see things decorated with these little sweetheart badges. Now, Dave, how do you think your father came across all of these little sweetheart badges?
My father being a jeweler, I think that he would have had access to these badges because he was actually in business at the time that he was serving, because he had a jewelry store in Halifax. He may have actually been selling these badges as well to help support kit shops or units. So that's kind of interesting, because now I'm beginning to believe that he actually appropriated those or maybe even sold them.
And I'm guessing he's likely to have mounted them himself.
I believe so, because I have not found another lighter like it. And knowing the different things that my father could do, this would be a task that he would really like to have done. And I'm pretty sure that he is the maker of this lighter.
Well, I checked our Zippo collection back at the museum to see if I could find an example to bring. And we have some that have 1 or 2 sweetheart badges on them, but we don't have anything like this. So it's kind of 1 in a million. Can you tell me a little bit more about your father?
My father passed away when he was quite young, at the age of 56. Being a graphic artist and a jeweler, he was a good carpenter, a good provider for the family. I was maybe 8, 10 years old when we were in the basement of the house when there was this big trunk underneath the stairs, and I don't know if my brother had gotten into it, but he opened it up and he started pulling this stuff out. And what they were all his wartime mementos. I was quite taken by that, that he had spent 5 years in the military during World War II. And then when he passed away, and I never got a chance to really come back to all these mementos until I retired.
One of the things that really holds us back in doing research on people who served during the Second World War is that the Federal Privacy Act restricts our access to service records. You're actually able, as next of kin, to get a copy of his service records. It's $5, and it takes some time, but they can get you a copy. But what we were able to kind of piece together, there's a magazine called The Signal Log. We actually found an article here, and it actually lists that Frank R. Oakey is a hep and jive fiend. He hails from Vancouver City itself, and also creates works of art for the Signal Log. And here, this is actually the signal mast of the Signal Log newspaper, in which he's listed Ordinary Signaler Frank R. Oakey, RCNVR. And what we surmise, given his background as a graphic designer, it's a distinct possibility he may have actually made this masthead.
Yes, it's quite possible. He was quite capable of doing all of that.
Now, Dave, I understand that you also served in the Canadian Armed Forces. Do you mind sharing a little bit about that?
I joined the service almost right out of high school. I was influenced by my father's service, and I wanted to do some time in the service for my country. And I was only in the service for, I think it was 18 months, and then my father passed away. At that time, I got out of the service because of the difficulties with family at home. And I spent 8 months as a civilian working in a warehouse. And it was quite interesting because I still kept my hair short. And when I was going up and down the aisleways, I was marching. My colleagues would say, "What are you doing?" And I said, "What do you mean?" They said, "All you do is talk about the Army, and when you're marching around or walking around picking parts, you're marching." And I said, "Well, I just can't get it out of my system." So they said, "Well, what are you doing here then?" So I went down to the recruiting office, I told them my story, and I ended back in the service, and I spent 45 years in uniform.
Well, Dave, this is fantastic. This is a wonderful grouping of items of your father's that you brought in. I really appreciate you bringing them in today. What are your next steps from here?
Well, I thank you very much for allowing me to come onto your program, because you have introduced some new facts about my father that I really didn't know anything about. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to investigate further and try and get my dad's actual record and go from there.
Excellent. Well, if the museum can be of any help, please let us know.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I am going to try and research them a little bit more. I'll request his service records. That should answer most of my questions I have about that.
Coming up on Militaria.
It was quite unusual to see someone released in 1915. Obviously, this was something quite severe that afflicted your great-grandfather.
My name's Ruth Blackie, and I'm a retired Master Warrant Officer in the Canadian Armed Forces. I brought in artifacts today for 3 of my family members. The release papers from my great-grandfather and tiny newspaper clipping about his brother. From my grandfather, I have his Toronto Irish Regiment cap brass.
It's impossible to overstate the impact the 2 world wars had on families. From the start of World War I to the end of World War II was only 31 years. Globally, 160 million people served in the 2 wars. Countless families sent husbands and sons to both. Many never returned. And among those who did, wounds often ran deep. Women and daughters worked in military support roles and on the home front. War was in everyone's life. Some families grew when servicemen came home with war brides. Others suffered great loss. Families lost homes, businesses, fathers. Those left behind uprooted, rebuilt, and found ways to carry on.
Thank you for coming in and bringing these wonderful artifacts with you today.
Thank you. I've brought in some artifacts from my grandfather, William Andrew Jessup. He was in the Irish Regiment of Canada.
With your grandfather's artifacts here, these were his cap badge and his ribbons, and then those were his ribbons that he would have been wearing when he released from the army at the end of the war.
Next is my great-grandfather, Finley Hall Henderson, who was a piper in the Black Watch Territorials based out of Dundee.
So the Black Watch was an infantry regiment in the British Army. It was a Highland regiment, so it meant it was a kilted regiment. They wore kilts. The great-grandfather was a piper in the regiment, and you've got his discharge paperwork. Tells when he joined, when he was released, why he was released, and all that sort of good stuff. So very interesting combination of artifacts. His sergeant's chevrons that are on this tartan material. The Irish Regiment of Canada was the only Irish regiment to wear a tartan for a kilt. I find it really interesting that that's what this backing is. And it makes me wonder, he was given that when he was promoted, and it was sort of like a grip and grin picture sort of thing. You slide this on over the arm, and he managed to pocket it, especially where it's got the regimental tartan in the background. Your grandfather's service was all in the Canadian Army. But your great-grandfather and your great-grandfather's brother were both in the British Army in a Scottish regiment known as the Black Watch. To me, it's no coincidence that your great-grandfather was also in the Black Watch, because the British Army used to recruit by areas. The cache for recruiting the Black Watch was Dundee area, where these two lived. So
my grandfather was 35-ish. Grandpa Henderson here, I think, was about 40.
Oh,
when
40,
he joined.
yes.
Yeah.
And he joined as a piper, so they probably could overlook a few physical shortcomings.
He was a musician. He was a very good piper. He had been in the militia as a young man, and then when the First World War broke out, he signed up in the Territorials.
Through your research, did you find out anything more about their service in the Black Watch?
What I did find in my research of him was I found him on a census as a child, and I found he had a brother that nobody had ever told me about.
Right.
So I started looking for the brother. He showed up 2 weeks before the wedding, so he was born with his mother's name. So I was able to find his birth, but then I couldn't find anything else about him. And then a cousin of mine was clearing out some things. We'd had a death with one of the older members of our family, and she showed up and said, "Oh, I found a couple of things you might like." And it was an old family picture of Grandpa Henderson, and then this little beat up newspaper article.
So Ruth, you spent your adult life in the military as a musician, both in the regular forces and joined the Reserve Army when you decided it was time to. You found it interesting when you read your grandfather's service records, that how your career sort of passed, not necessarily you did the same things.
I found out that he was part of 5 Division when I was in the Army Reserves. I mean, here I was in 5 Div, just like my grandfather had been. My career was as a military musician. As a musician, sort of the end of the piece, I just thought that was the nicest way to end it all for both of us, you know?
Although Ruth's great-grandfather was a piper, he was a soldier. He would have gone overseas with the battalion, would have been expected to have been a rifleman, and he would have been the poor soul that would have gone up on the parapet and piped them over the top on an attack, which to me made you the #1 target of the enemy. So soldier first, musician second, but you all had to learn how to be a soldier. The tragic aspect of it, of course, is when he was, learning how to dig trenches and how to sleep under the stars, and something happened to his kidneys.
He started getting sick, and it was kidney failure, so he was released after a year, and he went back to his job as a jute mill overseer.
Looking at the service record that you brought in, it's quite unusual to see someone released in 1915. Obviously, this was something quite severe that afflicted your great-grandfather for the Army to release him.
And he ended up dying from that in 1917. When Grandpa Henderson died, that was the catalyst to get his wife and the children over to Canada. Dundee was in a mess after the war. There was raw sewage in the streets. Everybody was in tenements. It was bad. What I always think about in those times is, that's terrible, having your husband die. And I heard through older members of the family before they passed that she wasn't doing well. She was very sad. She was trying to make ends meet with 5 kids and by taking in laundry. Everybody was going through it. Things that would have been just horrible tragedies now were very commonplace then. So it was her doctor that suggested, he said, "Do you have anywhere to go?" And one of her sisters had gone to Australia. Her brother-in-law, his half-brother, was already in Toronto. So they decided Toronto, but they didn't have the money. So she sent the two oldest to Toronto to get jobs and get settled and send money back. And then she followed a couple of years later with the three younger kids.
It was actually quite impressive that Ruth was able to put those all together, because she had to do a fair amount of work to gather up these bits and pieces. Probably a lot of work on her behalf to get these together in order to try and maintain a family story that she can pass on to future generations.
And I really appreciated the opportunity to tell the stories of my family members.
Thank you so much for bringing these lovely family artifacts in with you.
Well, thank you for listening to me. I do love to tell a story.
I'd be asking you now if you'd consider donating to the Army Museum, but I think that this is something that's more important to you.
These are things that they actually touched. My grandfather touched that. My great-grandfather touched that. My great-grandfather touched that too, because he's the one that mounted it on the piece of paper. There's two generations below me that really, I think, would be interested in touching something.
I'm glad to hear that these will be well looked after and be passed on to future generations in your family.
Coming up on Militaria.
If you were a warrior and you didn't have a Damascus steel blade, it was considered that you didn't really have the best you could be holding. Name's Al Massey. I'm retired from the Canadian Forces. I'm also a part-time bladesmith. I'm into Militaria and recreating medieval and ancient blades.
Damascus, the capital of Syria and one of the oldest cities in the world. Built at the crossroads of ancient trade routes that connected Egypt with Asia Minor and Lebanon with the Euphrates River Valley, Damascus has been an intersection of cultures, knowledge, and faith for almost 4,000 years. It was on the road to Damascus that the Bible says Paul the Apostle converted to follow Christ. The Muslim prophet Muhammad refused to enter Damascus, saying that man should only enter paradise once. But everyone wants a piece of paradise. Damascus has been fought for and conquered countless times over the millennia. Little wonder that the city's blacksmiths learned to forge legendary blades of steel.
Alan, you brought an interesting item here today, this particular knife. Maybe you can describe exactly what it is?
This is a traditional Kurdish-style dagger carried in the Middle East for a long time. This is what's referred to as a khanjar. What makes this special is its blade. It's an old Persian blade, very likely 300 years old or more, and it's made of a type of steel that locals referred to as fulad and nowadays referred to as woots, and classically it's Damascus steel of legend. It's a pattern referred to as kara taban, which sounds very fancy, but in fact the pattern simply means in Persian black and shiny.
The pattern looks like waves.
The reason for the name, Damascus was a big trading city in Syria. It was where they saw these, but Damas is also an early Arabic term for water, and it's the idea that the surface may look like ripples in water.
And this is unique to the type of metal that's used?
This is a very special type of steel. These were made in India and Persia by a process known as the crucible steel-making process, and they were smelting in crucibles about 1,000 years before they started doing it in the Western world. And this drove Europeans absolutely insane for hundreds of years when Europeans colonizing and trading with the Middle East started collecting these blades, and European metallurgists were trying to figure out how the heck this stuff was made.
What was the other reason Damascus was used was because of its strength or its ability to sharpen. I mean, obviously it's about edge here.
Yeah, because of the way the alloy is worked out, you have very, very hard particles embedded in a softer matrix. Think, if you will, like a rubber grinding wheel, but which has like diamond dust impregnated in the wheel or things like that that enable it to cut steel, but it's soft enough that you could push into it with your fingernail. That's the idea. You have these hard particles embedded in a softer matrix, and this means it holds an edge for a long time. It was very valued metal. All throughout the Middle and Near East, for a long period of time, if you were a warrior, it didn't matter if you were Afghani, if you were a Kurd, whatever, and you didn't have a Damascus steel blade, it was considered that you didn't really have the best you could be holding. Finally, at the end, though, very sadly, as local ores ran out that had the qualities you needed, it literally wasn't worth keeping up the secrets that were passed on from bladesmith to bladesmith. They literally forgot how to work the ingots properly. And this may have actually been why it eventually stopped being made.
Obviously, you're a collector, Al. How did you acquire this? And was this on your list of items that you needed for your collection?
Something like that was on my list of things to get before I die. I was in the service for a while, and our ship went to Istanbul, which is very well known for its bazaars and its antiques and everything else. And I went looking for a blade of this type of steel, and I was actually looking for something in the order of a traditional Middle Eastern saber blade, but they told me it was almost impossible to find them. And this is in the 1990s. Back then, in that area, these were all getting snatched up by collectors anyway. So I found one really nice one, I thought, and decided, well, you have yourself a genuine Damascus blade. Now you have something you can't make yourself. This stuff appears in legends about the Crusades. You have the story of Richard the Lionheart and Saladin meeting, and Saladin taking one of these blades and slicing a pillow in two and things like that.
So certainly some ceremonial side to it, or was it practical?
I don't know enough about the culture. This style is associated with the Kurds. Now, I understand that one of the things about Kurdish men were all supposed to wear this type of dagger, or carry a dagger with them. And this may have been the inspiration for Frank Herbert in his books, Dune series. He has these desert people, they all have their daggers, and they sing songs to their daggers and eat with them and sleep with them and everything. And this seems to be some of the inspiration of this, the importance of the dagger as a symbol essentially of one's status. Although this was a weapon, this wasn't really a battlefield weapon. A lot of the time it would be like a personal defense weapon, you could call it now, and a last-ditch weapon where if you were at such close quarters, you couldn't use anything else. If you had to haul this out in the middle of battle, you were in trouble because all your other weapons were gone or broken.
Thank you, Alan, for bringing these particular blades to show us today. This is a fantastic piece that any museum would be appreciative of to have it. Certainly my museum, it's not my mandate, but obviously this has obviously been something that is a prized part of what your interests are, and it's a very unique example of that. I haven't seen a dagger like that before. Obviously the rarity that we've seen today is presented very well, and I think it's a privilege to see something like that. Damascus steel was an eye-opener to me because, again, I didn't factor in, the technology or the processes, and also how old that particularly was. And the influences of India, of the Far East, and creating something very special that's held through. I learned what it takes to create something as unique and special that obviously Alan is very passionate about, but also at the same time, it's something that you don't see every day. The metallurgy and the history involved in creating that is epic. Is this the only one that you'll ever have in your collection?
Never say never.
So the next step is to find another partner for that one, if possible.
Exactly.